Good morning.
Good morning.
I guess just about everybody through the proverbial Second Church grapevine, which was working quite well this morning, is aware that our pastor, Evan, has zero voice, maybe a little bit. I have a bit more. There just seems to be something going around right now. I picked up my version of this down in Florida from my middle grandson. But believe I do have enough voice to get through the sermon this morning, and Evan is saving his voice for our communion and benediction, where his ordainedness is absolutely needed in order to pull off the sacrament of the Last Supper. Evan, I wondered if you would come forward. I know you're not expecting this, but there is something I need to do to help give me the confidence to get through this particular event here, and also to make you folks feel just a little more comfortable. Okay? Looks good. Okay. A point of familiarity is always handy. I've always admired Evan's bow ties, and by golly, I remembered this morning that I had one stashed away. Upon hearing, and let me preface this by saying, the sermon you're going to hear is Evan's sermon. First person references are to him. So when I'm saying I, that's I, sitting down front. Upon hearing Kay Mater read Colossians this morning, it would be easy to take Paul's words on Christian living and just make them into this one big list of do this, do that, or for most of us Christians, don't do that. Don't you do that. We grew up hearing that from the time we were in Sunday school or in catechism classes. The problem with this is it misses the entire point. It makes the life of being a Christian about following laws and regulations and not about following grace. And grace is really what it's all about. From an outside perspective, if someone were to observe two people, two Christians, one who lived according to the law and the other who lived according to grace, it might look like they were living the exact same life. It'd be hard to tell the difference. They would probably do and not do very similar things. But at heart's level, a life lived in grace is really very different from a life ruled by law. And at the heart of Paul's message for today is the message about Christian living. And I want to dive deep into that to help all of us get a better understanding. Our reading this morning began with verse 12, but to really understand what Paul's doing here, we need to back up to verse 1. Paul begins there saying, "Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your heart on things above. Set your mind on things above, and not on earthly things." And then in verse 3, Paul says, "For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God." Now, this is a huge point in Christian theology that we either ignore or we just don't understand it. As often as I've heard that line, I don't know if I ever wrapped my brain around it until I began to read through Evan's sermon last night. We often fail to understand the impact and the understanding that it should have on our daily lives. What Paul is saying is that when you were baptized, you died. You go, well, wait a minute. I thought we were being kind of reborn. Well, yeah, but you died. In Romans 6, he explains that when you were submerged under the waters of baptism, and back in those days, that's how baptisms were done. This is what John the Baptist was doing when we first find him in the Bible. He's always near a body of water. He's not at a baptismal font someplace. We kind of acquired that later. But when you're submerged beneath those waters in your baptism, that's when your old self died. It went away. It went bye-bye, or it should have. We're talking about your sinful self. The flesh, as Paul calls it, was put to death. And as you come up out of the waters of baptism, Christ's Spirit is now born inside you. And you share in the resurrection of Christ. Paul says if we suffer with Christ in a death like his, we will also enjoy a resurrection like his. And here's why that's important. If you died to your sin, then you don't have to let yourself be bound by the old you, by the old ways. You don't have to give in to sin or the things that used to hold you back. When you find yourself reacting to life in ways that do not honor God, remind yourself that you don't have to do it this way, that your old self died in baptism. And what's alive in you now is the Spirit of God. And thus you choose, and you should choose, to focus your heart and your mind on that Spirit of God, on the things that are above. In verse 12, where our reading began today, Paul says, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, think about that, God's chosen people. Even if you're comfortable with the idea of election or choosing and God having chosen you, I sometimes wonder if we really feel like God chose us out of our virtue. Not because of anything great about us, maybe he just chose us by default, because that's what God does, he chooses people. It's easy to look around and say, yeah, well, God chose me, but that person over there is so much more loving than I am, or that person sitting there is smarter, knows far more about the Bible than I'm ever going to know, and, well, she's just better than me in every single way. So why did God choose you? Was he looking for somebody to play third string on the Christian team? No. He wasn't choosing you to pad a roster. Now here's where Evan gets a little reflective. When I was a kid, I was part of an after-school program at the YMCA. Some of you have heard about it. I believe it's still around in many ways. It's called the Latchkey Program. And I remember playing pickup games in sports. Now, as a 10-year-old, I was chubby, and chubby kids, well, you never get picked first. I remember playing pickup games of football, just hoping so much that I would not be the last one picked. Because I was chubby, I wasn't very fast. Now, later, when football came along and they were playing the contact version of football, oh, they wanted the big guys then. They had a place to put them on the offensive and defensive lines. But if that football was two-hand touch or flag football, more often than not, you were back being picked last again. And so I remember the captains picking the teams. I remember getting passed by just hoping I wouldn't be the last person chosen, and eventually everyone got picked. So getting picked wasn't that big of a thing. What was big was feeling like you were wanted, like you were valued, like someone actually wanted you there on their team and didn't just pick you because, well, everyone has to get picked eventually, right? I always hoped that one day I'd get picked early on, or maybe even first. Wouldn't that be nice? And one day, for whatever reason, a team captain did just that. He picked me first. And even though this is a thing I thought I wanted most, when he did that, it didn't really feel all that great like I thought it would. Kind of felt like maybe he was sorry for me. And that's why he picked me. Even if you've never had that type of experience before, I wonder how often we imagine God's having chosen us in a process just like that. This person is better than me in way so many ways, so maybe God really wanted her or him, but not me. If God knew all the ways I struggle, all the ways I fall short, all the ways I sin, he wouldn't really want me on his team, would he? He may have chosen me, but it wasn't out of virtue. It wasn't because he really wanted me. It's not because I have something to offer. It's because that's just God's benevolent nature. He's a God who picks. But look at what God says through Paul here today. God says he's chosen you and you are holy. You are holy. That just blows my mind. Because I know all the ways I struggle, all the ways I fall short, and when God looks at you, he does not see those things. He knows them, sure, but it's not what he sees, it's not what he dwells on. He doesn't see you as you currently are, he sees you as you can be, what you will be through his Spirit. He knows what you're capable of, what your true potential is, and he calls you holy. I know about you, but that's just about the last adjective I'd ever use to describe myself, but that's how God sees you. He calls you holy and dearly, dearly loved. God chose you not out of default, not just because he wanted to pad his numbers on the roster. God picked you because of who you will be and what you are capable of doing. He picked you out of his great love for you. You are his. He calls you holy. And bearing all of that in mind, Paul says in verse 13 that you are to forgive other people as the Lord has forgiven you. Now that word forgive is kind of an interesting word. I became curious when I was thinking about it. How is it that these two English words, the preposition for and the verb give, come together and combine into one word or two words that come to mean what we think of when we use the word forgive? So I decided to do a word study on forgive and see exactly how it came into being. The New Testament was written in Greek, and the Greek word that we translate as forgive is the word charizomai. Now, charizomai is from the Greek word charis. Some folks say charis. But either way, it means gift or give. And the omai means it's in the middle voice, which means it's one of a reflexive action. You know, and the doctor taps on your knee at the physical and you don't have any control over it. It's a reflex. Greeks had a reflexive set of verbs. That means it should be automatic. It just happens. So that charizomai literally means is to give generously of yourself. So to forgive someone is to give generously of yourself to that person. And if you think about it, you can see how this could come to mean what we think of as forgiveness. If you're holding a grudge against someone, if someone has wronged you, it can be really difficult to forgive, to give generously of yourself to that particular person. You may not even want to see them, much less forgive them. But if you do give generously of yourself to someone, you might find that you feel a little bit differently about that person. You might find that you're liking them a little more, maybe even loving them. And then when you feel that way, it becomes a bit more difficult to hold something against them. The grudge kind of goes away. Christmas Day has just come and gone, but I imagine that you, like me, have learned that the proverb you heard as a kid is true. It really is more blessed to give than it is to receive. I know I found far more joy from giving a good gift than I do from receiving one. I think the same thing is true when we forgive someone. Often when we forgive someone, when we give generously of ourselves to that person, we find that we're the one who receives so much more. Because let's face it, it can be hard to forgive someone. If someone comes to us and apologizes and asks for forgiveness, it can be easier. But it's really hard if somebody wronged you, and harder yet if they don't think they did, or even harder than that if they think you're the one that should be sorry. You should be. That's really pushing the envelope there. Maybe you decide to be the bigger person. You'll go and apologize first because, hey, you probably aren't perfect either. But if you give that apology and they don't reciprocate, that's really hard. But guess what? You're a Christian, and that is part of what Christian living is, to forgive, to give generously of yourself, whether someone else bothers to reciprocate or not. So when Paul tells people to forgive as they have been forgiven, that could also be translated, give generously of yourself to others because you know what God has given generously of himself to you. And one last interesting thing while we're talking about the Greek, the first part of the word charizomai that we translate as forgive, that word charis, means gift where it occurs in the New Testament by itself. We usually translate that word as grace. Giving of yourself. In Greek, the word grace and the word gift are the exact same word, which shows how grace isn't something you can earn. It isn't something you qualified for and picked up. It is a gift from God. So that shows the kind of tie-in there is between the ideas of grace and giving of yourself. You could also say that we should be filled with grace for others because God has been filled with grace for us. And then Paul says we should clothe ourselves with God's compassion, humility, meekness, patience, and love. I love that use of the word clothe because it means to put on. See, the clothing you wear, that's a choice. I'm wearing a tie. I don't really like ties, most of you know, of any type, regular or bow. But if it were up to me in the summer, and believe me, if you've ever seen Evan in his office during the summer, what you're about to hear is true. If it were up to me in the summer, I might be up here in Bermuda shorts and a t-shirt with flip-flops because that's the kind of guy I am. But I choose to wear a tie. Likewise, I know many men don't like ties, but I surveyed the congregation this morning. I still see many men wearing ties. Looking good, too. Probably means your wife chose your tie for you. Well, keep listening to her because you look great. So even though wearing a tie may not be my preference, that was a choice I made to put that on. Likewise, when dealing with difficult people in your life, you may not feel much love or compassion or even patience for that person. And that's okay. Guess who does? God. And that's why you put on God's patience and God's love for that person. You are a Christian. It's in the midst of those times that we need to be able to take a step back and remind ourselves of who we really are, that we really are chosen, that God calls us holy. He calls us dearly loved. It's not about a list of do's and don'ts. It's about being awakened to the reality of our situation that we either don't know or too often forget. We have been called on to live a life of grace, not a life of law. The life we live out in faith. Sometimes you have to take a mental step back in order to ask God's Spirit to move through you, to dwell in you. To empower you, to surrender yourself to this Spirit so that you can die to yourself day after day, and as you do, grow in the Spirit day after day. It's about having so much of God's Spirit generously flowing through you and into you that you cannot help but have that Spirit flowing out of you as you give of yourself, as you walk the walk of grace and live out the life of God. Do so because He is calling you to do exactly that. Amen.